It started on a Tuesday. I remember it not because anything about that day felt significant enough to deserve a memory, but because the moment that planted itself in me happened so quietly and with so little drama that it was only later, looking back, that I understood what it had actually been. We were sitting across from each other in a small cafe we had visited so many times that the waiter no longer asked what we wanted. He just nodded when he saw us and brought it without being asked, and there had been a time when that small familiarity felt like evidence of something good between us. He just nodded when he saw us and brought it without being asked, and there had been a time when that small familiarity felt like evidence of something good between us. But you were scrolling through your phone, your attention somewhere else entirely, glancing up just often enough to remind me that you hadn't completely disappeared from the room we were sharing. I was talking about something. I don't remember what exactly. Something from work, or something small that had happened earlier in the day. The kind of thing you share with someone, not because it's important, but because sharing the small things is part of what being close to someone actually means. And then you smiled, but it wasn't the same smile I had been on the receiving end of enough times to know by feel. It arrived a second too late, catching up to the moment from slightly behind it. The smile of someone who had registered that a smile was required rather than someone who had simply and naturally produced one. You locked your phone and said, "Sorry, what were you saying?" And I looked at you for a moment before shaking my head and saying, "Nothing important. It doesn't matter." And maybe that was the moment everything actually began. Not because it hurt in any way I could point to clearly and name out loud, but because it didn't hurt. Because I sat with the smallness of what had just happened and felt nothing particular about it. No spike of pain or flash of hurt or urgent need to address what I had just experienced. Just a quiet and unremarkable acceptance that settled in without ceremony and stayed. And something in the quality of that acceptance told me, in the way that the body often knows things before the mind is ready to receive them, that I had already started adjusting to a version of us that had less in it than the one I had believed we were. At first, I told myself what we tell ourselves when we are not yet ready to look directly at something that would require us to act on what we find there. That people get tired, that life gets busy and demanding, and that not every conversation between two people who care about each other needs to carry the weight and the electricity of something new and beginning. That this was just a season and seasons pass, and what we had was real enough to move through a difficult stretch without losing its essential character. But then it started happening more consistently and with less space between each occurrence, and the story I had been telling myself began to require more effort to maintain than the evidence would comfortably support. Your replies got shorter, not cold in any way that could be directly addressed or named as a problem that needed solving, just smaller, like you were gradually and carefully reducing the surface area of your presence in my life without making the reduction obvious enough to be called a decision. I would send something, a thought that had occurred to me, something that had happened, a piece of my day that I wanted to share because sharing it with you had once felt natural and easy, and hours would pass before a reply arrived that contained just enough words to keep the conversation technically alive without containing enough to make it feel like anything. Yeah, true, I get that. And somehow, without fully noticing when the shift had happened, I had become the one responsible for filling in the space that your reduced presence had left behind. I asked more questions than I used to ask, told longer stories to compensate for the shorter responses, worked harder at the maintenance of something that had once sustained itself without requiring that kind of effort from either of us. One night I asked if you were okay, because I had learned to reach for that question when the distance became too pronounced to ignore, and there was a pause before you said, "Yeah, just tired," and I said, "Okay, get some rest," and meant it, even though something in me was still awake long after I should have been, reading back through our conversation, looking for something I might have missed between the lines. There wasn't anything to find there, But I kept looking anyway, because looking felt like doing something, and doing something felt better than sitting with the thing I was beginning to understand without wanting to understand it yet. That the distance wasn't a phase or a season or a temporary condition that would correct itself when the right circumstances returned. That it was a direction, and it had been moving consistently in one way for long enough that I could no longer honestly call it anything other than what it was. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with any of the markers we expect from moments that matter. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation that forced both of us to look at what had been accumulating in the space between us. Just a conversation that should have meant something, and didn't. I had a difficult day, the kind where the weight of ordinary things feels inexplicably heavier than it has any reason to be, where nothing has gone dramatically wrong, but everything feels slightly harder to hold than usual. And you were the first person I thought of, not out of obligation or habit, but because that instinct, the instinct to reach toward you when something felt hard, was still intact in me, even after everything I had been quietly noticing and quietly filing away. So I reached out and said, "I don't feel okay today," simple and honest, and without the careful editing I had begun to apply to most of what I sent you by that point. You replied after a while. "What's wrong?" you asked, and I said, "I don't know, just one of those days." And then there was another pause, and then you said, "You'll be fine, just rest," and that was the end of it. No follow-up question. No curiosity about what one of those days had actually looked like from inside it. No version of you leaning toward what I had said and wanting to understand it more fully. Just the minimum. Just enough to have technically responded. I sat with my phone in my hand and read those words several times, not because they were ambiguous, but because I think some part of me was still hoping to find something in them I had initially missed. Some warmth or concern that had been compressed into the brevity and just needed to be looked at more carefully to be seen. But there wasn't anything hidden there, and for the first time in the long stretch of weeks I had spent telling myself various versions of a story that kept the full truth at a manageable distance, I didn't feel confused about what I was looking at. I felt clear, painfully and completely and irreversibly clear, in the way that clarity sometimes arrives not as relief, but as the quiet and final closing of a door you had been hoping might still open from the other side. I didn't say anything after that conversation. Not that night, and not in the days that followed. Not because I was angry, or because I was waiting for an apology, or because I was building towards something I intended to eventually say. But because something in me had already shifted in a way that didn't require words to complete itself, had already moved from one understanding of what we were to another, without needing a conversation to make the transition official. After that, I started noticing, clearly and without the protective filter, I had been applying to my observations for months, everything I had been working to not quite see. That I was always the one who reached out first, that the initiation of contact had become so consistently mine that I couldn't remember the last time your name had appeared on my phone because you had thought of me and wanted to share that with me. That you never really asked how I was in the way that requires you to stay present for the answer, never asked in a way that communicated genuine interest in what the honest response might be. That I had slowly and without fully deciding to learn to make myself easier to respond to. Less complicated, less emotionally present, less fully myself, trimmed down to a version that generated less friction and required less of you to engage with. And the strangest part of all of it was that you didn't notice any of the changes I was making. Didn't notice when I stopped sending the longer messages that had once been natural to me. Didn't notice when I stopped asking the questions I used to ask. Didn't notice when I began matching your energy, instead of trying to bridge the gap between your energy and mine with extra effort on my part. I stayed a little longer after knowing what I knew, not because I believed anything would shift back to what it had been, or because I was holding out for a version of events where the distance reversed itself and we found our way back to the ease of earlier days. But because letting go of someone is not as simple as understanding intellectually that they are already gone from the thing you thought you were both inside together. There is a space between knowing and accepting that has its own duration and its own particular quality of pain, and I lived in that space for a while. Composing messages I never sent because sending them would have required me to admit to myself that I was still hoping for something I had already seen the evidence against. Replaying old conversations looking for the version of us that had once existed there, before the distance had made even the memory of that ease feel like something from someone else's story. Holding on to a version of you that had already been replaced by the version sitting across from me in that cafe, a second behind every smile. The day I finally chose myself didn't arrive with any of the power or clarity or emotional resolution that you might expect from a moment that significant. There was no dramatic realization that rearranged everything into sudden sense. No final conversation that provided the closure that closure is supposed to provide. No grand and definitive goodbye that gave the ending the weight it deserved. I just didn't reach out that day. And when my phone stayed quiet in response, I didn't move to fill the silence with something that would give me an excuse to keep waiting for a reply that would tell me something I already knew. I let the silence be exactly what it was, empty in an honest way, real in the way that only things we stop managing and allow to simply exist can be real. You didn't reach out that day, or the day after. And the absence of you, the quiet where your presence used to be, hurt less than I had spent a long time believing it would when it finally arrived. Because by then, the understanding had had enough time to settle fully into me. You didn't lose me in the way that losing someone happens when circumstances intervene, or timing fails, or something genuinely beyond either person's control creates a distance neither of them chose. You stopped choosing me, in 100 small moments that didn't announce themselves as decisions, but accumulated into the shape of one. In the late replies and the shortened messages, and the smile that arrived a second behind the moment it belonged to. In the conversation where I told you I wasn't okay, and you gave me the minimum and moved on, and in all the conversations like it that I had been quietly cataloging, without letting myself fully name what they added up to. In every moment that didn't seem important enough on its own to matter, but did. And eventually, in the quiet of a day when I simply didn't reach out and let the silence answer the question I had been asking for months, I stopped choosing you too. Not with anger. Not with bitterness, or a need to be understood, or a final statement designed to make you feel the weight of what had been lost. Just with the gentle and overdue act of turning back toward myself and deciding that the energy I had been spending on maintaining something that had stopped being maintained from both sides belonged somewhere more honest. It belonged to me.